I think we have all heard the saying, the early bird gets the worm, but that's not always true. Sometimes the second mouse gets the cheese. In the auto industry, it's not always best to be first. The public has to be ready for changes, and sometimes it's worth revisiting some of those innovative ideas. In this video, we will take a look back at some of the cars that were ahead of their time. Every new car on the road today has some sort of touchscreen infotainment system that has been installed. For most of us, this seems like something that has come around in the last 10 to 15 years, but it actually dates a lot further back. The first production car that was fitted with a touchscreen display was the 1986 Buick Riviera. It was called the Graphic Control Center, and it had functions for climate control and all AM/FM radio controls. This new age idea was dropped from cars in 1990 because most customers didn't think that it was a big deal. Little did they know that it would one day be in every car. Tesla may be the most popular electric vehicle manufacturer, but it certainly wasn't the first. General Motors released the EV1 in 1996. Pulling off a great electric car is no easy task, and to make matters worse, GM actually called the EV1 the Impact. This car had sort of a funky futuristic design. The EV1 had a hefty price tag, so GM leased electric cars to many different people that could afford to do so. Repairs on these vehicles were quite costly, and many of these cars ended up going to the dump, which drew criticism from environmentalists. General Motors stopped producing the EV1 in 1999, although they continued to service the cars. With the demise of the EV1, it gave way to the carmaker Tesla Motors being established in 2003. A year later, Elon Musk came into the picture, and the rest is history. Electric cars may seem like a recent innovation on the road, but there have been many different concepts throughout the years. The technology itself dates back to more than a century ago. The Baker Motor Vehicle Company manufactured several different electric cars between 1899 and 1913. This idea attracted several notable buyers, including Thomas Edison, who purchased one as his very first car. In 1902, Baker built a race car that ran in a race in Staten Island just to prove that electric cars had the speed to conquer gasoline vehicles. However, this race car was involved in a horrific crash that killed 2 spectators and injured others. As a result, this incident led to people having a lack of confidence in electric cars. It would take more than 100 years to change opinions. The Chrysler turbine car was an experimental vehicle that was powered by, turbines. Chrysler called the project the Jet Car. This lightweight car sounded like a jet, and it had several advantages. It needed less maintenance and could run on any flammable fluid such as jet fuel, diesel, kerosene, and even soybean oil. This car did not cause any significant shifts in the auto industry, but there are some companies that are still flirting with the idea. The AMC Eagle Wagon was a vehicle that paved the way for modern crossover vehicles, but no one knew it back then. This car was both futuristic and outdated at the same time. It was essentially a Concorde wagon that they made back in the 1970s and then slightly elevated it with a 4-wheel drive system. This made it a lot more comfortable when navigating through harsh weather conditions. The Aston Martin Company has had the Lagonda brand appearing on and off the luxury market since the 1940s. But the car that we will talk about here is the 1976 model Aston Martin Lagonda. It was sort of a wedge-shaped car that was a sharp contrast with other cars of its day. This was the first production car to use a digital instrument panel. The steering wheel not only looked futuristic, but it looked like it could power a spaceship, which is interesting because it also had push-button controls on the dash. The car also had a computer display and a voice computer that gave information that had never been used before in any car. However, the push buttons and voice computer were not always reliable. This car was very expensive and it was right up there with Rolls-Royce. It's no wonder that only the super wealthy people drove it. Some people loved the look while others hated it. It's not uncommon to see the car on different lists stating that it is one of the ugliest cars ever made. The 1999 Honda Insight was the first mass-produced hybrid car to go on sale in the US. The first generation Prius was available in Japan beginning in 1997. In total, there were about 12,000 Insights that were made until the end of its first generation's production in 2006. It came with a 1.0-liter three-cylinder engine that could produce 68 horsepower and was combined with an electric motor that added another 14 horsepower. The car got around 69 miles per gallon. The second generation Insight came out in 2009 but was discontinued 4 years later due to poor sales. And yes, there was a third generation that was produced from 2019 to 2022. So who knows, we may see this one again. The idea of a hybrid car is not new. The first one was the Lohner Porsche Mixte that was designed by Ferdinand Porsche in 1901. Yes, that's the same man who brought us Porsche and the Volkswagen Beetle. The Mixte four-wheel drive series was a hybrid version of the System Lohner Porsche electric carriage that was featured at the 1900 Paris World Fair. At the time, Ferdinand was young, and this type of vehicle that combined both electricity and internal combustion remained obscure. The Tucker 48 was a vehicle that was engineered and built by Preston Tucker. This vehicle was very advanced for its time, and it came with features like seat belts, disc brakes in the front and rear, and crash protection in the dashboard and steering wheel. It also had a windshield that would pop out in case of an accident, and a third headlight in the middle that would rotate from left to right to illuminate turns. Unfortunately, there were only about 50 units made. Tucker was accused of stock fraud and received negative publicity. This scared away most of Tucker's investors, despite the fact that he had been acquitted of all charges. He was forced to declare bankruptcy and all assets were auctioned off. As we have seen with some of these cars, they were ahead of their time because of their use of technology or design which signaled where the trends would go next. However, some cars just pushed some of the automotive boundaries further forward. This is certainly what the Porsche 959 did from 1986 to 1993. It was the fastest street-legal production sports car. The 959 topped out at nearly 200 miles an hour, which was unheard of in the mid-80s. The twin turbocharged engine and sleek aerodynamic design paved the way for modern sports cars. The Pontiac Aztek suffered the fate of being labeled as one of the ugliest vehicles ever made. But this vehicle helped set the standard for many of the crossover vehicles that we see today. It also featured innovations inside like a removable cooler and an attachable tent. In many ways, it also looks like it inspired the Cybertruck. Of course, we'll never hear that that was the case, but we can certainly think it. The Oldsmobile Jetfire and the Chevy Corvair Monza were the first production cars to be equipped with turbochargers. However, both vehicles were unreliable and had complicated turbocharging systems. The first car to be sold in the US with four-wheel steering was the 1988 Honda Prelude. But it wasn't the first. The Nissan R31 Skyline was released in Japan in 1985. However, it was the Honda Prelude that got all the automotive world's attention. It featured a fully mechanical system that allowed the rear wheels to cut in based on the steering angle. The rear wheels turned in the same direction as the front wheels when the steering wheel was turned less than 246 degrees. Nissan's steering system was a bit more complicated and worked with a calculating computer. Overall, consumers at the time did not care too much about the four-wheel steering feature. They were more concerned about performance and comfort than anything. But in the last few years, we have seen a little bit of a resurgence on four-wheel steering. HUD, or heads-up display, was first used on military aircraft back in the 1960s. This technology migrated over to cars in 1988 when General Motors offered it on the Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme. At the time, people were fascinated with it and thought it was something from the future, but they also were not quite ready for it. Today, there are more than 30 car makers that offer at least one model with a heads-up display. As we move forward into the future, this will likely increase because it is sort of a safety feature. Today, everyone has airbags in their cars, but if you're old enough, then you can certainly remember a time when that was not always the case. Some of the rudimentary patents date back to the 1950s, but in 1971, the Ford Motor Company built an experimental airbag fleet. General Motors installed airbags in a fleet of 1973 Chevrolet Impalas that were for government use only. The 1973 Oldsmobile Tornado was the first car with a passenger airbag that was sold to the public. Later on, General Motors offered an option of driver's side airbags in full-size Oldsmobiles, Buicks, and Cadillacs in 1975 and 1976. However, the airbag systems were discontinued in 1977 due to a lack of consumer interest. In the mid-80s, they started making a small comeback as an option in some vehicles. By the early 1990s, they had found their way into the majority of American cars. Airbags have been mandatory in all new cars since 1998. Auto manufacturers are constantly looking for new innovative features to give them an edge on their competitors in the market. If they strike it big, then they can reap some huge rewards. But just because it was a failure doesn't mean that they can't give it another try further on down the road. If the timing is right, it might just work that second or third time. What are some of your favorite car features that you have seen? Are there any that you would like to see them try or perhaps bring back? Let us know in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for watching.